This is the story of my friend Claire, though sometimes, even now, I wish she'd never told me what really happened. It all started 2 summers ago, in the small, sleepy town of Willow Creek. The kind of place where nothing much happens, until it does. Claire lived just a few blocks away from me, in a cozy little house with white shutters and a flower bed she tended religiously. Everyone in Willow Creek knew everyone, and most folks kept their routines predictable. That's why, when Samuel Hunt moved into the old Carter house on Maple Street, it caused quite a stir. Samuel was a mystery from the start. He'd been released from a psychiatric hospital only a month earlier, though the details of his stay were never clear. Whispers traveled fast in our town, and most people assumed he'd been fixed. The doctors must have thought he was safe enough to rejoin society. At first, he seemed harmless, just peculiar. He was tall and gaunt, with a permanent shadow of stubble and eyes that darted around as if he was expecting something, or someone, to leap out at him. He kept to himself, rarely speaking to anyone unless absolutely necessary. If you passed his house at night, you might catch a glimpse of him through the window, pacing like a caged animal. Claire and I used to joke about it. "He's like Boo Radley," she'd say with a laugh. Creepy, but probably just misunderstood. But as the weeks went on, little things started happening. Claire began to notice Samuel watching her. At first, it was subtle. She'd catch him standing on his porch as she walked her dog in the evenings, his face barely visible in the glow of a street lamp. Other times, she'd glance out her kitchen window while washing dishes and see him standing on the sidewalk, staring at her house, not moving, not waving, just standing there. "It's weird," she told me one afternoon over coffee. "But he's harmless, right? Maybe he's just socially awkward." I didn't like the sound of it, but Claire brushed it off. After all, Samuel hadn't done anything outright threatening. Yet. By the end of the first month, the little things started piling up. Claire couldn't ignore it anymore, but by the time she realized how serious it was already too late. For a while, Claire tried to brush it all off. She didn't want to be paranoid or jump to conclusions. Samuel might have been strange, but plenty of people were. Besides, he hadn't done anything, yet. But as the days went on, his behavior became harder to ignore. It started one night when Claire was closing her curtains. It was nearly 11 p.m., and the street outside was quiet, the way it always was in Willow Creek after dark. As she pulled the curtain over the living room window, she caught sight of him. Samuel was standing on the sidewalk across the street, staring directly at her house. Claire froze. He didn't move, didn't even try to hide. It wasn't like he was out for a late-night walk or looking for something he'd dropped. He was just there, his eyes fixed on her window. She quickly shut the curtain and stepped back, her pulse racing. She thought about calling the police, but what would she say? That her neighbor was standing on public property, looking at her house. That wasn't illegal. The next morning, she told me about it. "I'm sure it's nothing," she said, trying to sound calm. "He's probably just awkward and doesn't realize how creepy it looks." I didn't buy it. "Claire, that's not normal. If he's making you uncomfortable, you need to do something. Say something." But Claire wasn't the kind of person to make waves. She shrugged it off, hoping it wouldn't happen again. It did. 2 nights later, Claire woke up to a sound outside her bedroom window, a soft tapping, like the wind nudging a tree branch against the glass. She sat up, listening carefully. The tapping came again, steady and deliberate. Her bedroom was on the 2nd floor. There was no tree outside her window. Heart pounding, she crept toward the window and peeked out from behind the curtain. For a moment, she saw nothing but darkness. Then, just as she started to relax, she spotted it, a shadow moving in her front yard. It was Samuel. He was pacing back and forth along the sidewalk, his head tilted slightly upward as though he were looking at her window. Claire's hand flew to her mouth to stifle a gasp. She quickly backed away, her mind racing. Why was he outside her house in the middle of the night? She grabbed her phone, but then hesitated. Calling the police felt like overreacting. What if he had a legitimate reason to be there? Maybe he'd lost something. She decided to wait it out, but sleep didn't come easily that night. The next morning, Claire stepped outside to grab the newspaper and froze. Sitting on her porch, right in the center of the top step, was a white daisy. She stared at it for a long moment, her thoughts spiraling. Had Samuel left it there? If so, why? Was it a gesture of apology, or something more sinister? When she told me about it later that day, I couldn't hide my concern. You need to document this, I said firmly. If something happens, you'll need a record. Dates, times, everything. Claire agreed, though she still didn't seem convinced it was a serious problem. But the daisies didn't stop. Every morning, she'd wake up to find another one on her porch. By the end of the week, her unease had grown too big to ignore. She started keeping her curtains drawn and avoided leaving the house unless absolutely necessary. Then, one Friday night, something happened that made her realize just how real the danger was. Claire was sitting in her living room, scrolling through her phone, when she heard a noise outside. At first, it was faint, like a distant shuffle of footsteps. She tried to ignore it, but the sound grew louder, more deliberate. Someone was in her driveway. She peeked out through the gap in her curtains and immediately regretted it. Samuel was standing near her car, looking directly at her front door. This wasn't the passive, unsettling behavior she'd seen before. There was something different in his posture now, intentional, almost predatory. Her hands shook as she reached for her phone. She dialed 911, whispering her address to the dispatcher. The operator assured her that an officer was on the way, but those minutes stretched out like hours. She stayed hidden behind the curtain, watching as Samuel began walking up the driveway toward her porch. He stopped at the bottom step and stood there, staring at the door. "Do you see him now?" the dispatcher asked. "Yes," Claire whispered. "He's just standing there. I don't know what he's doing." A moment later, red and blue lights appeared at the end of the street. Samuel turned his head toward them, then calmly walked back down the driveway and disappeared into the shadows. The officer knocked on Claire's door a few minutes later. "We spoke to him," he said. "He says he was just out for a walk and stopped to admire your flowers. Says he didn't realize he was bothering you." Claire felt a surge of anger and frustration. "At 11 o'clock at night? In my driveway?" The officer shrugged. "It's strange, but he didn't do anything illegal. If he comes back, give us a call." That night, Claire didn't sleep at all. She double-checked every lock in the house and kept a heavy flashlight by her bed, just in case. When morning came, she stepped outside to see if there were any signs of Samuel's visit. The driveway was empty, but there was something waiting for her on the porch, another white daisy. Hook, Claire realized then that Samuel wasn't just strange. He was methodical, calculated, and he wasn't going to stop. By the time the second week rolled around, Claire was at her wits' end. She felt like a prisoner in her own home, constantly glancing over her shoulder, her nerves fraying with every passing day. Samuel hadn't approached her since the police came, but the daisies kept showing up on her porch. Sometimes they were fresh, their petals crisp and white. Other times, they were wilted, as though they'd been picked days before and kept deliberately, waiting for just the right moment to be placed there. Claire started leaving her lights on all night, hoping it would deter him. She even set up a cheap security camera by her front door, the kind you could monitor from your phone. For a while, it seemed to help. There were no footsteps, no figures lingering in her yard. But then came the night when everything changed. It was just past 1 a.m. when Claire woke to the sound of a faint creak. At first, she thought it was just the house settling, the kind of noise you could ignore if you were too tired to care. But then she heard it again, a deliberate, measured creak, like someone was moving through the hallway downstairs. She held her breath, straining to hear over the pounding of her heartbeat. Had she locked the door? She was sure she had. She always double-checked it before going to bed. But what if she'd forgotten? What if? The thought was interrupted by another sound, this one unmistakable, the quiet scrape of a chair being moved. Someone was in her house. Claire grabbed her phone and called 911, her hands trembling so badly she almost dropped it. As the operator picked up, she whispered, "There's someone downstairs in my house. Please send help." The operator spoke calmly, asking her to stay on the line, but Claire barely heard the words. Her eyes were fixed on the door to her bedroom, waiting for the knob to turn, for the intruder to make their way upstairs. The minutes dragged on, and then she heard another sound, a soft shuffle, followed by the distinct creak of a step on the staircase. Whoever was in her house was coming closer. Claire panicked, looking around her room for something to protect herself. Her eyes landed on the flashlight she kept by her bed. It wasn't much, but it was heavy. Gripping it tightly, she moved to the far corner of the room, her back pressed against the wall. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs. For a moment, everything went quiet, and Claire dared to hope the intruder had changed their mind and left. But then, she heard the faintest sound of breathing. It was so soft, she almost thought she was imagining it. The door handle turned. The door didn't open all the way, just enough for Claire to see the sliver of a shadow standing in the hallway. She didn't move, didn't make a sound, willing herself to disappear into the darkness of the room. Seconds stretched into eternity before the sound of sirens cut through the silence. The intruder froze, the shadow retreating as quickly as it had appeared. She heard the creak of the stairs again, followed by the slam of the front door. By the time the police arrived, whoever had been in her house was long gone. The officers searched the house and confirmed there were no signs of forced entry. The front door had been unlocked. Claire's mind raced. Had she forgotten to lock it? She didn't think so, but in her exhaustion and fear, she couldn't be sure. One of the officers pulled her aside. "Do you know anyone who might have reason to scare you? Anyone who's been acting strange?" Samuel's face flashed in her mind, but she hesitated. "There's a man in my neighborhood," she admitted. "He's been leaving things on my porch. He watches me sometimes. His name's Samuel Hunt." The officers exchanged glances. "We'll look into it," one of them assured her. "But for now, make sure all your doors and windows are secure. Get some rest if you can." But Claire knew rest wasn't coming. The next morning, she found another daisy on her porch. This time, it was placed directly on top of the welcome mat, as if Samuel, or whoever it was, wanted her to know they'd been close enough to touch her door. She checked the footage from her security camera, her stomach twisting as she scrubbed through the recording. There was nothing unusual at first, just the empty street and her front porch bathed in the glow of the porch light. But then, around 12:45 a.m., she saw it, Samuel stepping into view. He was carrying something, a bouquet of daisies. Claire watched, horrified, as he walked up to her porch and knelt down, carefully arranging a single flower on the mat. He straightened up, then turned to face the camera. For a long moment, he just stared, his expression blank. Then, almost imperceptibly, he smiled. Hook, the footage cut off after that, but the damage was done. Samuel wasn't just watching her anymore, he was inside her house, inside her life. And Claire had no idea how far he was willing to go. The footage from the camera changed everything. Seeing Samuel look directly at the lens, that faint, chilling smile on his face, it made it impossible for Claire to keep pretending this wasn't serious. She went to the police station the next morning, security footage in hand, hoping it would finally be enough to force them to act. The officer on duty watched the video with a furrowed brow. "We'll pay him a visit," he said after a long pause. But there's nothing illegal about someone standing on a porch or leaving flowers. Unless he makes a direct threat or trespasses inside your house again, there's not much we can do. Claire felt her frustration boil over. So I have to wait until he hurts me? The officer raised his hands defensively. I'm not saying that, ma'am. But we'll do everything we can to keep an eye on him. In the meantime, you should think about staying somewhere else for a while. A friend's place, maybe. Claire took their advice. That evening, she packed a small bag and came to stay at my house. It felt safer to have someone else around, and I was more than willing to let her stay as long as she needed. We spent the first night on edge, jumping at every little sound, but nothing happened. The second night was different. It was just after midnight when I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing. Groggily, I reached for it and saw Claire's name on the screen. Claire. What's wrong? Her voice was barely a whisper. I think he's outside your house. My heart sank. I got up as quietly as I could and moved toward the window in my living room. Peeking through the curtains, I saw him, Samuel, standing in the middle of the street, looking directly at my house. I turned back to Claire, who was sitting on the couch, pale and trembling. Did he see you? She shook her head. I don't think so. But how did he even know I'm here? That was the question that kept us both awake for the rest of the night. Samuel eventually disappeared, but the damage was done. He knew where she was, and he wanted her to know he knew. The next morning, Claire insisted on going back to her house. I can't drag you into this, she said. I'll be fine. I just need to get some stronger locks. I didn't want her to leave, but I could see the determination in her eyes. So I drove her home and helped her install deadbolts on her doors and window locks on every first-floor window. We even put a wooden dowel in the sliding glass door to the backyard. For a while, it seemed like the precautions worked. The flowers stopped, and there were no more sightings of Samuel outside her house. Claire started to relax, thinking maybe the police visit had scared him off. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. One evening, about a week after Claire moved back home, she called me in a panic. He's back, she whispered. Where is he now? I asked, my stomach twisting. Outside my backyard, she said. I can see him from my bedroom window. He's just standing there, looking at the house. Call the police, I told her. I already did, she said. They're on their way. I stayed on the phone with her as we waited, listening to the silence stretch between us. Every now and then, she would whisper, he's still there. Finally, she said, the lights. He's gone. What do you mean? The motion lights, she explained. He walked toward the back fence, and the lights turned off. I can't see him anymore. When the police arrived, they searched the area but found no sign of Samuel. The officer in charge sighed. He's being careful, he said. But we'll keep patrolling the neighborhood. Let us know if anything else happens. That night, Claire called me again, her voice shaking. He's not going to stop, is he? I didn't know what to say. The next few days passed uneventfully, but Claire was a wreck. She started sleeping with the lights on and carrying pepper spray everywhere she went. She even bought a personal alarm, the kind that emits a high-pitched shriek when you pull the pin. Then, on a quiet Sunday afternoon, she found something that made her blood run cold. She'd been in the backyard, pruning the overgrown bushes by the fence, when she noticed something glinting in the dirt. Brushing the soil away, she uncovered a small glass bottle, the kind used for preserving flowers. Inside the bottle was a single daisy, perfectly pressed and preserved. Claire didn't know how long it had been there or how many more were buried in her yard. But the message was clear. Samuel wasn't gone. He was just waiting. Hook, that night, Claire packed her bags again, determined to leave Willow Creek for good. But Samuel had other plans. By the time the last night in Willow Creek arrived, Claire was a shell of herself. Every sound made her jump, every shadow felt alive. The police had been patrolling the neighborhood sporadically, but they couldn't sit outside her house all night. She knew that. The moving truck was scheduled for the next morning. Just one more night, she whispered to herself as she walked through the house, checking every lock. The doors were deadbolt, the windows latched shut. She even moved a heavy dresser in front of the back door, just in case. But no matter what she did, it felt like she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. Around midnight, she tried to sleep, but her nerves wouldn't let her. Instead, she sat in the living room with the TV on, its muted glow casting flickering shadows on the walls. She kept her phone in her hand, ready to dial 911 at the first sign of trouble. It was around 1 a.m. when the first noise came. A soft, deliberate knock at the front door. Knock. 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 Claire froze, her breath catching in her throat. She stared at the door, her mind racing. She'd already checked the camera feed earlier, no one had been outside. The knock came again, louder this time. Knock. 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 Her hands shook as she opened the app for her security camera. The feed flickered to life, and she gasped. The porch was empty. She stared at the screen, willing herself to believe it was just a malfunction. Maybe the camera hadn't picked up the movement. Maybe. Knock. 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 It was louder now, almost urgent. She backed away from the door, her pulse racing. Go away, she shouted, her voice trembling. The knocking stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then she heard it, a scraping sound, low and deliberate, coming from the back of the house. Claire turned toward the hallway, her stomach twisting in knots. The sound grew louder, moving along the wall, as if someone were dragging something sharp across the siding. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911. There's someone outside my house, she whispered, her voice breaking. Stay on the line, the operator said. We're sending officers to your location. The scraping stopped, replaced by a soft thud. It came from the back door. Claire's eyes darted to the heavy dresser she'd pushed in front of it. Her chest tightened as she watched the dresser shift, just a fraction of an inch, but enough to make her heart stop. Someone was pushing from the other side. She stumbled back, clutching the pepper spray in one hand and her phone in the other. They're trying to get in, she hissed into the phone. Officers are on the way, the operator repeated. The dresser shifted again, scraping against the floor. Claire let out a shaky sob, her mind racing. She had nowhere to run. Suddenly, the movement stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then came the sound that would haunt her forever, a low, raspy whisper, so faint she almost thought she imagined it. Why don't you let me in? Claire's knees buckled, and she collapsed to the floor. The whisper was followed by more knocking, this time coming from the windows, first the one in the living room, then the one in the kitchen, then the one upstairs. Knock. 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 The sound surrounded her, echoing through the house. Whoever was outside was moving fast, circling the house with an impossible speed. Her phone slipped from her hand, the operator's voice a distant hum she could barely hear. The only thing she could focus on was the knocking. Then it stopped. Claire's breath came in short, panicked gasps as she scrambled to her feet. She grabbed her phone, her fingers fumbling to pick it up, when she heard the unmistakable creak of a floorboard, inside the house. She froze. It was coming from the hallway, just outside the living room. Police are almost there, the operator said, her voice calm and steady. Claire wanted to scream, to beg them to hurry, but the words caught in her throat. She stared at the doorway, waiting, praying she wouldn't see what she knew was coming. A shadow appeared first, long and distorted, stretching across the wall. Then, slowly, Samuel stepped into view. He stood in the doorway, his face partially hidden in the shadows. But his eyes, those piercing, hollow eyes, were locked on hers. He didn't speak, didn't move. He just stood there, watching her. Claire gripped the pepper spray tightly, her hands shaking. "Get out," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. Samuel tilted his head slightly, as if considering her words. Then, without warning, he took a single step toward her. The sirens blared outside, their wailing cry shattering the tension. Red and blue lights flashed through the windows, and Claire heard the sound of car doors slamming. Samuel stopped. For a moment, they just stared at each other. Then, slowly, he backed away, disappearing into the shadows of the hallway. The police burst through the front door seconds later, their voices echoing through the house. But Samuel was gone. The officers found no sign of forced entry, no fingerprints, no evidence of how he'd gotten inside. The only thing they found was a single white daisy, lying in the middle of the living room floor. Claire moved out the next morning, leaving Willow Creek behind. But no matter how far she went, she couldn't escape the memory of that night, or the fear that one day, she might hear that sound again. Knock. Knock. Knock.